the sludge report. More than two-thirds of the sewage sludge produced in Florida is disposed on land in the St. Johns River Basin. Much of that is trucked up from South Florida. A new report says this disparity is costing the region plenty, both financially and environmentally. Here to talk about it is John November. He's the attorney and executive director of the Public Trust for Conservation. Good morning, John.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for being here. So, the Public Trust commissioned this report by an independent economic and engineering consulting firm called the Balmoral Group, and it is being released just this morning. But what did you ask them to look at? And broadly speaking, what did they find?
Yeah, we've known for a long time about the environmental impacts of the biosolids land application process in the St. Johns River Basin and have been trying to protect our basin. Now we finally understand the economic impacts. And unfortunately, the practice of hyper concentrating biosolids in our basin is going to leave us with a cleanup liability of around $1.12 billion over the next 40 years. So it was really important to understand that we are, as a community, being forced to cover these costs long term, and knowing the economic exposure is really important for our community.
And I want to get down into a little bit more of a breakdown of the costs that we're talking about, cleanup versus kind of external other costs on top of that number that you just said. But let's begin by just explaining for people who don't know, what are biosolids?
Great question. So when a wastewater treatment plant gets human and commingled industrial waste, they take the water out of it. And the leftovers, that's what we call sewage sludge. And then the sewage sludge is usually lightly treated up to a standard and heavy metals are reduced. And then at that point, it's trucked away from the facility and brought either to a landfill or land applied. And the land application of biosolids is used at either ranches or at farms to grow grass. But unfortunately, they're not just getting nitrogen, the main nutrient that's needed to grow grass. They're also getting a lot of nasties, and they're also getting an imbalance in the amount of phosphorus that's entering the ecosystem. And that imbalance of phosphorus causes algae blooms, specifically blue-green algae blooms and microcystis, which can be toxic to both humans, wildlife, and the natural environment.
And there are different levels that biosolids can be treated to. And so when we're talking about sewage sludge, we're talking about this Class B, kind of the lowest level of treatment. If people are watching our live stream, they'll see some images of land application of the sludge, but also there's an image, for instance, of someone holding something that looks like dirt in their hands. That's not what we're talking about. That really is this higher treatment that is sometimes used even by people at their homes. Pellets are kind of this dirt-like material that is treated to a higher degree, but we're talking about something that's not quite that clean.
Yeah, we're talking about something that's much sludgier, much wetter, much smellier, and doesn't go through that higher level of treatment. We actually are major proponents of treating the biosolids and the sewage sludge to higher levels, turning it into compost, turning it into a fertilizer product that can actually be applied agronomically. The issue with Class B biosolids from a nutrient perspective, and that's what feeds the algae blooms that we're most concerned about in the St. Johns River, is that you have a stable amount of nitrogen to phosphorus. So when you apply the nitrogen that you need to grow crops, you unfortunately almost always get too much phosphorus. And that's a real problem. But there are products that limit the amount of phosphorus that can be applied agronomically. And we're hoping that our state continues to move in that direction so that we have valuable and sustainable products. And this can be not just a waste, not a disposal, but actually a reuse that's beneficial to our society as a whole. And unfortunately, that's not what's happening right now.
And so it's important to note that this report that you are releasing this morning is looking specifically at those costs that are related to nutrient pollution and how that impacts the St. Johns River and the St. Johns River Basin. There are other chemicals and pollutants contained in this material, and we will talk about them a little bit later. Those include things like forever chemicals, sometimes known as PFAS. It includes things like pharmaceuticals, pesticides, microplastics. Those are all other things that are often contained or almost always found to some degree in biosolids. This report is not looking at those directly or the costs that might be associated with those, but we will talk about those. Let's start, though, if we can, by talking about why the lower St. Johns Basin is getting so many of these biosolids.
It's a frustrating thing. It's an unintended consequence of a piece of state legislation that was passed back in 2007 the people of South Florida were seeing the Everglades collapse because of this practice of land applying biosolids in the industrial and agricultural areas directly outside of the Everglades. And they decided to pass a piece of state legislation saying we are no longer going to allow the land application of biosolids in South Florida. So what do we do starting in 2013 when the rule becomes effective? Well, let's truck it just far enough north where the ban is no longer effective and land apply on these rural, often underserved communities of the upper St. Johns River Basin and do the cheapest and dirtiest thing. And that happens to have really unfortunate unintended consequences on the St. Johns River. We've actually, since 2013, now we're looking at a dozen years of application. And unfortunately, even if we stopped right now, the legacy nutrients, the legacy impacts of this practice is going to be felt by us for the next decades, maybe centuries.
And we're looking at a map right now for those watching our live stream that show the application sites county by county. And you can see, none in South Florida, and then this real intensification around Central Florida, which for people who don't know the geography of the St. Johns River, that is the headwaters. It's a north flowing river. And so those tributaries, those lakes that are being impacted basically then carry up through the rest of the St. Johns River. And that's where we see the algal blooms.
Yeah, unfortunately, that comes up right through the St. Johns River, past Jacksonville, and right on out to the Atlantic Ocean. We are hoping to mobilize the communities of the upper St. Johns River, St. Johns County, Flagler County, Duval County, to say that this practice must stop. I mean, it's been an inequity that's survived for a dozen years now, and we're hoping that it gets limited through rule changes that we fought for in 2020. But unfortunately, some land appliers haven't been consistently applying within the bounds of the law, and it's important as a legal advocacy organization that we are there to ensure that the laws are followed.
And we know that when this shift happened in 2013, we were seeing significantly higher volumes of biosolids moved to this area, disposed of in this area. And regulators know that at the same time, the level of pollutants in the river was surging, that kind of followed right along with it, even though the amount of agricultural land has greatly diminished because of development. And you would expect, I think the report says that the amount of agricultural land in that area declined from 360,000 acres in 2006 to just 190,000 acres roughly today. But that the nutrient loading, the pollution of those nutrients remains the same.
Yeah, it's unfortunate. I mean, we need agriculture to grow food. It's an important part of our society, but it's shrinking. And the fact that the nutrients are still increasing, there has to be an explanation. And published research from the St. Johns River Water Management District directly correlates the amount of phosphorus and nitrogen impairments, which means polluted water bodies in the St. Johns River, to the practice of land applying biosolids. I don't want to say that there aren't other sources of pollution. There are. There's lots of issues for us to work on, but the massive transfer of the negative environmental externalities from South Florida to North and Central Florida is truly alarming. And it has been alarming to me and the St. Johns River Keeper and a number of our other partners who've been working on this issue for a number of years. But we've never been able to, and I don't think it's ever been done across the entire country, maybe the world, an actual economic analysis, not just of the economic impacts on the site where farms are closing in Maine and Michigan because they have PFAS pollution, because they have these emerging contaminants of concern, but also downstream. There are impacts outside of where these biosolids are being land applied. And now that we can finally understand what the lower bounds of those are, because we're just talking about phosphorus pollution. If you think about the unintended or unknown consequences of the PFAS issues, which we're just beginning to understand, and other emerging contaminants of concern, the cleanup liabilities could actually be worse. So it's time as a state to take this seriously.
If you're just joining us, we're talking about the financial and environmental costs of sewage sludge disposal in the state. You can join our conversation if you have comments or questions by calling 904-549-2937 or emailing firstcoastconnect@wjct.org. You can also reach out on Facebook, Instagram, or X at FCC On Air. I am talking to attorney John November about this. And so let's talk a little bit more about the cost, because this analysis looked at projected cleanup costs over a 40-year period of specifically the impact of the phosphorus, this nutrient pollution. And you found in that report, or the analysis, the consultant found that it could be up to 1.4 billion. But they also looked at something, you know, more indirect. The cost of, for instance, lost property value, lost recreational value, lost ecosystems, that are no longer functional. And they looked at some previous events that have actually caused an impact on land, on property values, which I
Right.
thought was interesting. They looked at, for instance, like how a red tide, how a toxic algae bloom actually causes people's home values if they live along or near the river to drop.
Fishermen obviously care about the health of our river, people who want to swim in our river, which it's upsetting to me that a lot of times it's not safe to swim in our river. Hopefully that changes in the future. But this now hits home to everyone. The fact that these algal blooms could affect our property values throughout Northeast Florida, and the fact that the increasing algal blooms over time caused by this practice could hit our pocketbooks. That's a serious concern to many, and recreational values are significantly diminished when there's these algal blooms. People, if you swim, and dogs often, if they swim in these waters, can get violently sick, and dogs have even died. So it can have really massive indirect impacts, and it's nothing to shy away from. It's time as a state to invest in the infrastructure and innovative technologies that can deliver us from this problem. It's not all doom and gloom. There are wastewater treatment facilities coming online in the state of Florida that are turning these biosolids into valuable products, and the private market is ready to come in and make it happen. But if we allow people to keep on doing the cheapest and dirtiest thing, that's what they're going to keep on doing, because you know taxpayers in South Florida are going to have rate increases if they are not allowed to continue dumping their waste on the headwaters of the St. Johns River. But it's an imperative that we no longer allow this transfer of these negative costs, both for the environment and economically, from South Florida to North and Central Florida. And we want to build a coalition to stop it.
Got a message from Michael on Instagram saying there is a sludge removal industry aiming to get our tax dollars for perpetual muck removal in Florida. The true root causes of muck in Florida waterways is myriad. However, our dollars must first be spent on improved wastewater treatment facilities, residential/commercial septic system closures, and stormwater management. Beware treating systems and not causes when funding Florida's environmental problems. We also have a call from Jim in Jacksonville. Good morning, Jim. Go ahead.
Hi, Jim Simcoe. I'm a power engineer. I work in the wastewater industry, and I think your guest is very much correct. It's a lack of political will. The technology to deal with sludge in an effective and economical way is not new, and it's not difficult. The Milwaukee Metropolitan Sewerage District finances itself directly off of the commercial sales of milorganite, which is a nitrogen fixant literally made from irradiated and cooked leftover activated sludge after the treatment process. Effectively, the buyback period to be able to treat on a county, it went in, especially in an agricultural state like Florida, you're looking at a buyback period of about 15 years for an effective wastewater treatment facility where you're only pushing effluent into the St. Johns and you're not pushing sludge in. But realistically, a buyback period of 15 to 20 years if you can commercially sell your safed sludge as a nitrogen fixant to the agricultural community.
Jim, I'm not
Thank you.
sure. I'm not sure what you mean by a buyback period. Can you explain what that means?
Yes. So when you do a large capital project, the buyback period is effectively how long it takes to pay off the capital investment plus interest based off of the revenue you receive.
Gotcha.
Both from rate hikes and from ancillary sales, like in this case, selling deactivated sludge.
Gotcha. Okay. Yeah. Thank you, Jim. I appreciate that. John, you're nodding to that. I mean, there are facilities in Florida that do treat sewage waste to a higher level, and it is sold, often as, a product compost, right? People will put it on their gardens.
Mhm.
And, to Jim's point, it can be irradiated, it can be cooked. A lot of pollutants can be resolved in that way. But does that take care of things like PFAS or these pollutants of emerging concern, pesticides, microplastics?
Not always. It kind of depends if the source of the sewage sludge is commingled industrial and human waste. If it's just human waste, the only thing that we really got to worry about is pharmaceuticals making its way into the.
Which is no small
It's
thing.
no small thing, and it's still of concern, but hopefully, and it's diluted enough to that won't be that concerning. But PFAS, for example, is cancer causing, and so unfortunately, unless you heat these materials to a very high level, very high temperatures, the fluoride bonds in those PFAS don't break down. That's why they're called forever, except if you heat them to very, very high levels. So in Indiantown, there's actually a new facility going in that heats the biosolids to such a high level that the PFAS does come out and is broken down in most circumstances. JEA is actually doing class AA biosolids. They're just investing into their Buckman facility now to do that as we speak. And so that's a very positive development, but it's going to take time. PFAS still will remain a concern. Their technology is turning it into more pellets that you referred to earlier, which then can be treated to higher levels. And hopefully, frankly, phosphorus and nitrogen are very valuable, but not phosphorus is not valuable here in Florida because we don't need it. But across the world, phosphorus is incredibly valuable. So if we can actually get this product dried and turn into a more stable product like we'll have in Jacksonville, we can then hopefully send it to fertilizer manufacturers who can use this as the base material as opposed to mining phosphorus, which has its own environmental issues. So
Right.
there is hope.
Yeah. We've got a call from John on the south side. Good morning, John. Go ahead.
Hi, good morning. Thank you for the interesting educational conversation. I'm just curious, does this cast shade on what we've been told for decades, that the principal source of phosphorus pollution was non-point source pollution, chemicals from runoff from our fertilizing of lawns and that sort of thing, versus point source pollution? Does this fall into the point source category? And that's all. Thank you.
Good question, John. Typically we think of point source as kind of a factory. Does agricultural land use of a biosolid count as a point source or kind of a non-point source? And to his point, what is the role of just fertilizers on lawns and stormwater runoff?
Great question. So it's a little bit nuanced, but when they land apply the biosolids onto the farms, that's a point source because it's coming out of a discrete conveyance onto the land. When it leaves the land, typically through either runoff, if there's rain, so if they do it during rainy season, or if the groundwater's high, it'll run off the surface, but mostly it's actually coming into the groundwater. And when it comes into the groundwater, then makes its way directly into the St. Johns River. We now know that how porous the limestone is in Florida, so it's all connected. That is a non-point source.
But his question is kind of more like we've been told typically that the primary culprit is, maybe lawn fertilizer
Yeah.
and these non-point sources. And I think he's curious how big of a deal is this relative to those other sources?
Recently, there's been a lot of really cool research into this, actually. And unfortunately, what we're finding, and we don't want to hear it, is that it's us. It's our waste. It's our human waste, which is one of the number one contributors to pollution problems. People in South Florida wanted to, for example, blame the massive algae blooms they were having both on the east and west coasts on fertilizer pollution coming from the sugar industry, et cetera. But when a isotope study was done to actually pinpoint the exact type of pollution that was entering the system, they found that a vast majority of it was actually coming from septic tanks and sewage.
Mhm.
So it's difficult to separate biosolids from other types of human waste because it has the same nutrient signatures. So it's a combination, though. We don't, it's important that we continue to apply fertilizer in a responsible way because it's all part of the nutrient budget. Unfortunately, in the lower St. Johns River Basin where we are here in Jacksonville, we've spent so much time and so much money reducing the amount of nutrients entering our system as a whole.
Aren't we the upper?
We're the lower. The upper is I know
Oh,
it's
I've got it
confusing
backwards. Okay, I'm
because it
sorry.
makes its way up the
Okay.
St. Johns River from the base of it. It's all connected though. So we have something called a basin management action plan where we're actually taking definitive steps to reduce the amount of nutrients in our system in both the Jacksonville area and then a little farther south. Well, unfortunately, there is no BMAP. There is no plan for reducing nutrients at the headwaters of the St. Johns River. So there's no active management happening there, which results in massive increases in the amount of nutrients entering the system. So it's a massive problem that's not being challenged effectively.
And so that relates to a question that we have from Cindy on Facebook, because she says, great topic. Curious what the reason would be for the state not to regulate this in a more environmentally responsible way. This seems like a no-brainer. Thanks for bringing this to our attention, John. And I want to ask you about that because, one of the sources, certainly one of the producers of sludge and biosolid application in that area is a company that is currently not in compliance with state regulations, and it's been allowed to apply excess biosolids beyond what the state law specifically says at this point is the limit. So tell us what's happening. Why is it that they're allowed to operate out of compliance? Why isn't the state, punishing them?
Yeah. So in 2020, our Florida legislature passed something called the Clean Waterways Act that basically did do a better job of protecting our environmental resources from the threat of biosolids. As a part of that 2020 bill, they gave communities, mostly in South Florida, where our most concentrated populations are, 3 years, up to 3 years, to come up with a plan for what else they were going to do with this stuff. Unfortunately, that type of planning and investment in infrastructure didn't really happen. And so when June 21st, 2023 rolled around and it was time to apply these biosolids in an agronomic way, which means applying it based on what a crop needs, not applying it based on how much waste we need to dispose, which is currently what's happening in a lot of farms in Central Florida where this practice is occurring. They basically said, woe is me. This is too expensive. We don't have a plan. We don't know where to put it. And did a back and forth process with FDEP to essentially delay the application of the new rules that would be more protective of the St. Johns River. And we have been absolutely advocating every week to make sure that this is happening. And finally, just this week, it looks like there is going to be an enforcement order, a consent order entered into between the FDEP and H&H to bring them into compliance with the law. They are going to have a small, short off-ramp time to give them time because, H&H is not a villain here. They are disposing of the waste that is being generated by all of us. We're all Floridians here. And we all need to come up with more sustainable solutions to produce this waste. And there is going to be increased costs to not do the cheapest and dirtiest thing. But over time, as we invest in that infrastructure, those costs should come down. Just like the caller said, there's a payback period where if you invest in the new technologies, it actually can become both financially and certainly environmentally sustainable over time.
And we should say we did reach out to H&H Liquid Sludge Disposal. They're based in Suwannee County, and they've been disposing of biosolids for about 30 years. We didn't hear back from them, but they do have a statement on their website that says H&H takes pride in our commitment and everyday actions that help promote a sustainable environment. Each year, our company finds new ways to reduce and reuse materials. H&H is committed to enhancing and preserving the environments in which we work. So, John, you say now there's this consent order, which is basically kind of a legal agreement between regulators and a polluter of some kind.
Exactly.
And so is that something that you expect would have any immediate impact on the water quality in the St. Johns? And I kind of want to get back to the point that you made about the legacy of these pollution inputs, because sometimes the year or two after an application isn't even the boom year for when you're going to see nutrient levels spike.
Yeah. So I don't know if it would be like immediate because this is such a large system, but they are the single largest land applier of Class B biosolids in the entire state of Florida. So it is a big deal. Deseret previously was one of the largest land appliers. They've actually stopped applying Class B biosolids. We think it's because of the fears related to PFAS and other pollutants of emerging concern because they might want to develop that land in the future. So this is the single largest and only major facilities or appliers that are still applying above the limits allowed. So I do anticipate over the next couple years we'll start to see reductions. I actually do believe that the Earth is very resilient. The St. Johns River can be very resilient, but we got to give it a helping hand. And this is an opportunity for us to allow the laws to be followed and allow for our fishing and wildlife to be able to respond. So I do believe that it will happen for us long term, but unfortunately, when these pollutants enter the system, they stay there until they're used. And unfortunately, invasive species and algae are the ones that are most opportune when it comes to using these nutrients. And so, over many decades, it's going to take time, but I believe that the St. Johns River can begin to return to where it was, but it's going to take time.
I want to ask you about reuse of land because there, a lot of this land, as we say, is making the change from agricultural to housing very
Mm.
often or other kinds of development. And there is so much we don't know about the impact of things like PFAS pollution, but there is study, in that area. The Water Keepers Alliance recently came out with a report I think last month or the month
Mhm.
before about how heavily associated biosolids are with pollutants of emerging concern and PFAS. And it has led some states to shut down, cropland,
Mhm.
agricultural uses of land because they've been polluted.
Yeah.
And so what do you anticipate the cost of those kinds of impacts being, because it seems that, while phosphorus and nutrient pollution, as you say, the river's resilient, those things can be perhaps mitigated. Those can be cleaned up. Some things like forever chemicals, it seems like it'd be a lot harder and a lot more expensive.
Yeah. We as a state are, Florida specifically, lacking knowledge about how significant the issue of PFAS really is. Back in 2024, the Public Trust was able to get legislation all the way through three committee meetings of the Senate, and we're not able to get it to move in the House at all, related to identifying the sources of PFAS pollution. Now, there is domestic sources of PFAS pollution, your Teflon pans and other minor sources, but by identifying where the PFAS is at the industrial source and finding strategies to reduce it is critical to stopping that moving into the future. And unfortunately, our legislature didn't decide to gather that key information to know the full extent of this problem. But hopefully, we continue to take steps and follow the leads of other communities across the country
I
who
mean,
are
when the legislature votes and says we don't want to know where this is coming from, we're not going to look into that. Who are the who are the voices that are pushing back on the request to find out more? Like who are the who's lobbying against learning more about the sources of PFAS?
they're silent assassins a lot of the time. We don't know exactly who's lobbying it against it because their children drink the same water we do. So I don't know why they would not want to have more information on this topic, because I think it's critical to say that we're not trying to regulate it until we know the extent of the problem. We know the extent of the various contaminants of concern that are in the water, and maybe how we can control it at the source. Don't be punitive. Instead, find out collaborative solutions for if there is a known problem. Many entities will want to take action to solve it. But unfortunately, it does put a bullseye on their back if they're known polluters, and so they'd rather have their head in the sand and not address the situation rather than come up with fruitful solutions.
Sure, big costs associated. Just briefly, we got an email from Alex saying the Navy has a novel waste disposal system on Ford-class aircraft carriers manufactured by a Canadian company called Plasma Arc Waste Disposal System. It uses high-voltage plasma to, quote, burn waste. The byproduct is elemental gases and non-toxic effluent. This would be a good use for the extra capacity JEA bought with their new nuclear power plant. That's in Georgia. Just briefly, John, I mean, this report has now been released this morning. It's available. People can find a link to it on our website. What would you urge people to do if they're interested in this issue?
Yeah, learn more. Consider joining our coalition of entities who are going to communicate with policymakers, regulators, and our local government entities to say, hey, we need a voice in this matter. So for so long, we've kind of been a forgotten stakeholder here. The South Floridians certainly didn't want to see their Everglades collapse. We certainly don't want to see the St. Johns River collapse. And we certainly don't want this to affect our property values, our ability to recreate in the key resource of Northeast Florida, which is our St. Johns River. And it's time to grow a voice and make sure that we're equally represented in Tallahassee and Washington to ensure these protections are included.
All right. John November, attorney and executive director for Public Trust for Conservation. Thanks so much for being here.
It's been my pleasure.
All right.